Welcome to Kindred, hosted by me, Kate, and my sister, Jen. In this podcast, we explore our human relationship to the natural world. In connecting to this planet, we also connect to understanding, compassion, and empathy. How can we see ourselves not as separate or above animals in nature, but a critical and integrated part of an active ecosystem? Through conversations with animal advocates, scientists, conservationists, and many others, we look to inspire a new awareness of how and why we connect to animals and nature in order to repair and restore our relationship to the natural world. Hello and welcome back to Kindred, everyone. How's it going, Jennifer?
It's going. Yeah, it's a little gray and a little,
a lot gray and a lot
this winter. Yeah, but it's all right.
So I've got some animal companions here today. So if we hear any extracurricular noises, that's just one of my new kitties, Izzy, and my dog Blue, as usual, is here. You are in your recording studio, I see. So
yeah, exactly. Very quiet. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's quiet out here. So that's the point. Yeah.
So, Jennifer, are you ready to talk about ants today? I sure am.
I sure am, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so excited. And I'm not being condescending to myself. I actually really mean that. Did I ever tell you the story of years ago when Dave, my husband, and I were driving somewhere, and I was in one of my thought processes, and which you've experienced, lucky enough. And out of the blue, I asked him if he ever wonders what the language. I was like, "Do you ever wonder what the language of ants is?" Yep. And there was this long pause. And he was like, nope.
Never wondered that.
Nope. No.
I think most people would answer that same way.
And then I literally looked at him like, "Oh, do people like not think about that?" So, oh boy, that's me. Anyway.
So yeah, you got to talk to an expert.
So finally, after years of deep thoughts about ants and their language, that's getting answered today. So I'm pretty pumped.
Yeah, that is pretty cool.
So let me introduce you to our guest today, Dr. Andy Suarez. Andy is a professor at the University of Illinois with the Department of Entomology, and he studies the ecology, evolution, and behavior of ants. And when we started researching this episode, I actually reached out to Dr. May Berenbaum, the entomologist we spoke with in the episode Bugs, the Unsung Heroes. Do we all remember that?
Yep.
And she recommended that we speak with Andy. So thanks so much, May, for that introduction. We really appreciate it. And why do we want to talk about ants today, you asked, Jennifer? Well, the answer would be, honestly, seriously, I think that, ants are one of those species that are everywhere, literally, right? And we see them every day, and we don't know anything about them and what they are actually doing
right
in our world. And, how are they we don't know that they're keeping our world clean and healthy, what they're actually doing. And they're just so small, and we see them as inconsequential, which today we learned they are not. So, right. It's just like, it's important to know who and what is around us, I think. And just because we may not acknowledge them doesn't mean that they aren't critical to our well-being and the health of this planet. And, so maybe we can cut them a break, be grateful for them even, there's all of that. So I just think they're, again, a great example of knowing the world around us and the ecosystems that we are literally integrated in. And thanks so much in advance for Andy. Great conversation. So
he was great.
He was great. So let's head over to our ant expert, Andy Suarez, and we will see you at the takeaway. Andy, thank you so much for joining us at Kindred today. If you could introduce yourself and tell us what you do.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. My name is Andy Suarez, and I'm a professor at the University of Illinois. I study the ecology, evolution, and behavior of ants. And so I'm excited to answer any questions you might have about ants today.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I have to say, I've been interested in ants for a really long time. Maybe awkwardly, I don't know. I just think they're amazing little creatures. So we are very excited for you to join us today, all the way from Australia. So thank you for that with this epic time change. So I once saw what I would call, I guess, a sculpture of what an ant colony looks like underground. And I guess someone had poured some kind of material down into the earth and into an ant colony, really hoping there were no ants still left in there. But after the material had hardened, they excavated the site, and the extent and complexity of the tunnels was astounding. And it just covered this large area of ground. So could you tell us about ant colonies and the structure and I guess the inner workings of their underground world?
Sure. Yeah. So ants are fascinating. They're incredibly diverse. Over 15,000 different species, and they nest kind of almost anywhere you can imagine. Many nest underground, like you described. Others nest up in trees and twigs or branches. Others make their own nests out of carton or fungus. So they're incredibly diverse. They kind of occupy every niche on Earth. The subterranean nests are really common. The casts that you saw were likely made by someone named Walter Tschinkel, who's become somewhat famous for making these nest casts. And he melts either aluminum or zinc in a large kiln, and you'll pour it underground, usually in sandy soils that the metal will penetrate pretty well, and it's then easier to dig up. And then it provides this fascinating insight into what the structure of a colony looks like underground, which of course we can never see, right? Because of the nature under the soil. And you get incredible insight when you do that. Not only is it kind of beautiful, like a piece of art when it's removed from the ground and cleaned up, but the nature of the nest, the components that make up the nest, like each chamber, the space between chambers, how the tunnels go from chamber to chamber, often helically, how deep they penetrate underground, which might depend on the depth of the water table or how warm or cold the colony needs to keep. All of this tells you something about the behavior of the ants that made that and their needs in terms of where they store eggs and where the queen lives, what temperature and humidity they need. And so you get amazing, not only biological insight, but really interesting insight into the behavior of ants by studying those nest casts. Because, an individual ant isn't that smart. They don't have a large brain, just a small mushroom body. But collectively, right, by following very simple decision rules, they create these really complex and beautiful structures that are necessary for their survival.
So when you say, did you just say mushroom body?
Yeah, so we call the aggregation of kind of nerves and neurons that make up the brain of an insect like an ant. It's often referred to a mushroom body because of the shape of it. It looks kind of like a mushroom.
Okay, interesting. So I guess in general, like how many ants are in a colony underground then?
Yeah, again, it depends on the species. Some ants have very small colonies, maybe a dozen workers. Okay. These are often kind of like these really rare, highly specialized ants, while other ants like army ants or leafcutter ants can have millions of workers in their colony at any one time.
Wow. So I guess this artist that I now know as Walter Tschinkel, that was a large nest, and that was somewhere, where was that he was doing these?
So he works primarily in Florida, and some of his most kind of famous elaborate nests are from seed harvesting ants. It's a genus called Pogonomyrmex, and they have really deep nests, often not only for them to live, but to store seeds underground.
So if we are just walking in our backyard and you see, the anthill on the outside that we see, that typical ant in the, northern hemisphere, how deep would their nest go underground?
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends on the ant. Some ants, again, live really shallowly, often with most of the nest underneath a stone or log, and then extending into the soil, maybe a foot or 2 feet. While other nests of ants, for example, an ant called the winter ant, which tends to come out only when it's cold outside, its nest can be 3 meters deep and it uses that again to buffer itself from the temperatures.
Okay.
So they really vary.
Interesting.
Wow.
So then, do ant colonies have, because I'm thinking about a lot about bees, right? So I'm kind of comparing them often to bees in my brain. Do they have a queen, and does she have her own little queen quarters?
Yeah, so like bees, ants are called eusocial. That is, they're obligately social. Ants, bees, wasps, termites. And they have a queen, or sometimes many queens, and ants that we call polygynous because they have more than one queen. And then they have an area that they tend to stay, largely because the temperature and humidity is great for the eggs and larvae, which she's laying almost constantly. And she'll have a retinue of workers that'll help take care of those eggs and larvae, like nurses, similar to how bees work.
But they can have multiple queens in one colony and they don't fight with each other. That's interesting. That's different than bees. I used to keep bees, and just that whole thing about you have to go in and make sure there's no more queen cells or else you're going to lose half your bees. They'll leave. So that's interesting that ants are more collaborative than that. That's interesting.
Yeah, it depends on the ant. Some ants do have a single queen. That's very typical for most ants. But then there are some ants that take it to the extreme. And this is particularly true for some what we call pest or tramp ants, that ants that have been introduced by humans throughout the world, where they become really ecologically and economically disruptive, household pests, agricultural pests. And a characteristic of many of these pest ants is that they'll have huge numbers of queens, thousands of queens.
Wow.
And the consequence of this is not only do they have a huge capability for growth, right? Thousands of queens, each one producing thousands of eggs a day. Right. But it means that if you have a potted plant or a crate or something, and a few ants get in it, it's likely that those ants will include queens. And so if you're moving these plants around for the horticultural trade, or you're moving boxes around internationally, like, for a company, you will not only just occasionally bring workers with you, you will bring entire colonies with you. Wow. With new queens. And when they get to a new area, they'll become established with the potential to spread and cause damage.
Wow, interesting. So within so how do, so we're on the East Coast, we're just outside of Philadelphia. So if we're thinking in the context of our ants here, in general, how many species of ants or types of ants do we have here on average? I mean, do you know?
Yeah, so in a state like Philadelphia, you might have, locally, like in your yard, you might have 5 or 10 species of ant, particularly if you live in a wooded area. Across the state, you might get closer to 80 species of ant or so. And then, if we spread out to the United States, I can't remember the exact number, but I think it's now over 600 species of described ants that are in the United States. And then as you get into, more tropical areas, you can find, thousands of species in like a rainforest in Brazil.
So, and often, like Jen was saying, we've got those little ant mounds. And if I'm, let's say, having tea or lunch or something on the patio and crumbs fall, those guys, they come out and they take those little crumbs down into that little pyramid hole. But what generally are ants feeding on? And then how do they feed their ant babies?
Yeah. So ants, typically, like your average ant, is a scavenger, right? It's really feeding on anything it can find opportunistically, whether it's crumbs, dead insects, even live insects that it might collect, but also foraging for things like nectar from flowers or honeydew that's produced from insects like aphids that excrete honeydew, right, as they feed on plants. And that's a really important carbohydrate source for many ants. And then at the other extreme, you have very highly specialized ants, the obligate hunting ants that really specialize on certain types of prey, like only feeding on millipedes, or collembola, which are springtails that are really common in the soil. And then there are ants that are what we call fungus growing ants. That is, they usually bring in leaf material or other detritus, and they grow a fungus on that, and then they live off of the fruiting body of the fungus, and it's a really highly specialized relationship. In fact, it's thought of as the oldest known form of agriculture, in which these ants have to cultivate their fungus, much like we cultivate our gardens, to keep them clean, free of parasites and other fungus, in order to have this food source that they maintain.
That's crazy. I never knew that. And then why would an ant or a bunch of ants, why would they rather come into your house, let's say, when they find your honey? I have some that come in and get into my honey, than just stay outside and find stuff out there, just because that's an easier thing for them to get? Why would that? It seems like that would be much more work for them, but.
Yeah, and again, it depends on the ant. Some ants are pretty well adapted to the way humans have modified the world, right? And so if you think about an urban environment, it has characteristics that are quite different than a natural environment. And some of that is this kind of shelters that we create for ourselves, but also buffer the environment from too much heat or too much cold, too much rain. That would be very attractive to a wide variety of organisms that might move their nests right into your house.
Right.
And so there are some ants like the odorous house ant. That's a really small ant that's attracted to sugar. You can recognize it in Pennsylvania, for example. If you smush one with your finger and smell it, it has a very strong odor, thus its name, of either coconut or blue cheese. Different people think they smell different things, and that's based on this chemical that they have in them. But it's an easy way to identify it. And their colonies are incredibly mobile, so they might start outside. But then, if it's a little too hot or rainy, they'll find the walls of your house as a very suitable nesting place.
So they could be living in the house already and just be like, wait, we know there's sugar in here. We're going to go find it. Okay.
That's right. They could be living in the soil just outside your house or inside your house. And then another really interesting thing about ants is that, again, individuals aren't all that smart, but collectively they'll have a memory, right? They will remember where resources are, in part because when they go to a resource and it's something that is valuable, like a crumb or honey, they might leave a foraging trail back to their colony. And that chemical scent that they leave back to the colony lets other ants know where that resource is. And through time, right, those trails will build up. And even if workers die or disappear, the colony moves, there's this memory of where food was. And if it's a really good food resource or a location where food is typically found, that trail or memory will get reinforced. And that's why they keep coming back.
Okay. So other ants actually smell the trail. That's what you're saying.
That's right. Okay. They will recruit other individuals to where they found a food source.
And that's my next question too, is that so that leads me to think of these chemical trails, because I was thinking as I have a very strict catch and release in my house, so I sweep up the ants and then I put them outside, and I'm always like, I'm so sorry, I don't know where your colony is, you're gonna have to get back, but you just can't live in my honey, so I'm gonna sweep you out. But I mean, ants seem to have like a highly complicated and advanced system of communication. So talk to us about ant behavior in context to how they communicate and run such an intricate social system, and how do they keep such a massive community in sync and running smoothly, and how do they find their way around? They're often so tiny.
Yeah, I think that's such a fascinating topic. Ants are remarkable in their ability to communicate. And while ants often have eyes that are, for insects, relatively well developed, they're not great at seeing things. Instead, they communicate by touch with their antenna or other sensory organs, and they pick up chemical signatures from their environment. A key to the success of ants, in part, is that by having a large colony, they exhibit division of labor, right? So they have individuals who can do things in parallel rather than in sequence, and many individuals who can do things. And often there's specialization among individuals. For example, like honeybees, young ants tend to be nurses, and they hang out in the colony where it's safe. And then as they get older, they'll do things like undertaking to remove dead ants. And then as they get even older, they'll switch to foraging and then leave the nest to look for food, which is often considered the most dangerous thing you can do as an ant, because you're now outside of the protected environment of the colony.
Right.
So simply by looking at the age of an ant, you'll get different behaviors, right? Mm-hmm. Because they're more prone to do different things as they age. And that starts allowing that colony to function collectively, make sure all things are being done simply by having workers of different ages. In addition, anytime an ant bumps into something like another ant, it's getting information chemically from that ant. Was that ant inside the colony? Was it outside? Does it have food, or did it recently experience food? Is it an alarm pheromone that's in the air suggesting there's a threat nearby? Or is it a trail pheromone suggesting there's food nearby? And so simply by interacting with objects in the environment or other ants, it's getting information that might change the decision rules it's using to decide what to do at the moment. And so the simple, if you touch something, either continue doing what you're doing or change what you're doing to something else based on the frequency you encounter something, right? These really simple decision rule trees, once you add them up among many different individuals, each one that might have a different predisposition for one behavior or another based on age or experience, now you get this incredibly complex social environment, this colony level distribution of behaviors that allow a colony to function incredibly efficiently. But again, you might not have ever predicted that just by watching the behavior of a single individual, because it's the context, the social context, that allows the colony to function the way it does.
But that makes sense that you're saying like bumping, like the antenna and the chemical sort of transaction that happens, because I have watched ants a lot, and they do this, and I'm always wondering, like, they bump into each other and they kind of meet head on and they do this sort of bumping thing, and then they carry on their way. And I guess that's the transfer of information that they're doing at that moment. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's and they do that with other insects too. So, if an ant bumps into another ant outside of the colony, the first thing it might assess based on its chemical signature, like, if your chemicals are very similar to mine, we're likely from the same colony, let's cooperate. If your chemicals are really different, you're likely from a different colony and we should compete, or you're a different species and you might be a food item, right? So
Right.
all those chemical signatures out there in nature are relaying an incredible amount of important information.
Wow, that's very interesting. Now, also, how long does an ant, and it might vary species to species, but how long do they live? Like, I'm thinking again of honeybees, that in the summer, they don't live very long at all because they're working very, very hard. So
Yeah.
I'm curious if that's true for ants too, or not.
Yeah, so ants a typical worker ant might only live a few months. Some of the larger species of ants have workers that might live more than a year. There's an ant that I've seen in Argentina called Dinoponera australis, the tropical hunting ant. Their workers are over an inch long. I mean, they're just huge. And we've seen them in captivity live, almost 2 years, which is kind of ridiculous for an ant worker. Yeah. In contrast, like honeybees, queens can live many years. There are leaf-cutting ants, as I mentioned before, or army ants have these, incredibly large queens that might live 30 or more years. And that's a fascinating question. You have two individuals, the same DNA, right? They're sisters, a queen and a worker, yet the worker will only live a few months, the queen will live 20 or 30 years. And it's become a fascinating question for people who study kind of the genetics of aging, and what is it that our body is doing in terms of the proteins it makes and all the changes that happen as we age. And you would think that, workers are not reproductive, right? They're not expending all this energy into ovary development, into wing muscles. And the queen, in contrast, might be laying 1,000 eggs a day, incredible energy expenditure. Yet it's the queen that's outliving the workers by, 10 times. And a number of labs throughout the world have been trying to understand that. What is it about queens that allow them to live so much longer than workers?
Yeah, I bet that's astounding. I never ever would have ever guessed that. That's crazy.
Except for the fact that the whole colony is at her beck and call, sort of, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, the workers are, they've, through developmental changes, right? At a critical time during development, as a larva is developing in the colony, it'll get fed differently. And if it gets fed certain types of food or amounts of food, it undergoes like all this, changes in the genes that are expressed. Development becomes a queen. Others are somewhat suppressed and they become workers. And again, workers are often sterile. They don't have wings. And so you have the queen or other workers in the colony, by controlling the way larvae are fed, are causing this cascade in terms of what a larva becomes, a queen versus a worker. And then you have this environment in which now workers are really ephemeral, right? Because they're not reproducing, they can do all of these high-risk tasks, leave the colony, forage, and it doesn't matter if they die, because it's in our case, just cells as part of the body. They turn over really rapidly. It's just the reproductive tissue that's important.
And then the queen always has the top workers at their peak. They're going to live for a few months, and they're not going to live for a year and get worn out and work half the day and call it a day and say, I'm tired and I'm, that's it for me. I'm going on vacation. But that makes sense, actually. That's incredible. I'm blown away by that. So then really the way they work together and everyone's doing their part and they know their place and they know their job and they know how to communicate. It's like this well-oiled machine that just with ants that have hundreds or thousands of ants or however many can be in a colony, everyone's doing their part and it just works because that's what they do, I guess. Because you would think it could just be mass chaos in there.
Right. Yeah. It is amazing to think that you have such a large decentralized society, right, that functions as well as it does. And I think, E.O. Wilson famously referred to ants and bees and wasps as a factory inside of a fortress, right? They live in these underground tunnels, or they create this nest well buffered against the environment, protects them against competitors or predators. And then within that fortress, they have these workers that, again, are using division of labor so that there's a queen in charge of reproduction and the workers that are in charge of all the other tasks in the colony. And even among those workers, they're subdividing those tasks to increase efficiency, to make sure everything gets done. And there's no real central control. I think there was this thought, maybe 50 or 100 years ago, that the queen was somehow communicating the needs of the colony and was in control of the colony. And now we appreciate that's just not the case. Yeah. The queen has chemicals that she produces, and that when workers, touch and respond to those chemicals, yet there are other cues that workers are getting from other workers and from the environment. For example, if a storm comes and wipes out a bunch of foragers, and now your colony is without foragers, they realize that you're not encountering many foragers. And so a bunch of workers that might currently be nurses will change their behavior and start foraging to meet the needs of their colony. And again, they're doing it just following these simple decision rules, creating this unbelievably efficient, well, I shouldn't say unbelievably efficient. There's a lot of redundancy. Often there could be 1,000 workers who are doing nothing, and you're like, why are you even there?
Right.
But again, it works really well.
But for tiny little brains, that's actually pretty incredible. I mean, that really is that they
I agree. I think it's unbelievably amazing. And there's a lot we can learn from that by understanding those decision rules that these ants are using and creating these really complex patterns. I think, for example, in computer science and programming, people really seek to maybe we can learn what those decision rules are and then apply them to programs to make programs more efficient.
Yeah. Wow. So you were talking about what I would say with the dino ant. We had talked about that before, but I was telling the girls earlier that when I was hiking through Iguazu Falls with my husband at one point, and I come across this group we were all tourists, and there's a group of 15, 20 people in a circle, and when we kind of worked our way into the front of the circle, they were all looking at this ant, which on my life, it was 2 inches long. I mean, I think you said an inch or an inch and a half, but I'm going to say it was 2 inches long because that's what my brain was like. This is the largest. I'm like, we thought it was fake. It was just so enormous. And no wonder they can live a long time. He was like, hey, what's up? And we're like, on your way, sir. Because he was moving and people were like, don't want to get in his way. He was just so epically huge.
I think they can get to 2 inches. They are incredibly large. And I should say it'd be on your way, ma'am, right? Because all ant workers are females.
That's right. Yeah.
On your way, ma'am. Yes, right. Because you said that most ants are females, correct?
That's right. Males are really ephemeral. They're, with very few exceptions, males and social insects, the ants, specifically they're born, they mate, they die. They don't really do much else. They're kind of specialized for one purpose, maybe live a few weeks at most.
So I have a question about that because again, just from the bees where the queen goes out and mates, in ants, do these male ants live in the colony or does she go elsewhere?
That also depends on the species. So many ants have nuptial flights, just like bees.
Okay.
Pogonomyrmex harvester ant that creates those giant underground nests that Walter Chinkelcast, for example, are somewhat famous for having these mating flights where you'll see hundreds or maybe thousands of queens and males flying around. And like bees, queens will mate with multiple males and get a huge amount of sperm that they store for 20 years as they grow their colony. Other ants will mate within the nest, even with their own sisters, in a form of inbreeding. Again, you see this in many of these introduced ants or kind of trampy pest ants. And then other ants have other specialized forms of mating that might not be either extreme, like not within the nest, not flying around in these big nuptial flights. But females, for example, in some species of ant, release pheromones to call males.
Oh, yeah.
Like moths do, and then the males will fly to the female and mate with them.
Okay, interesting. That's so fascinating. Do you think that just is evolutionarily, it just makes them more hardy as a species to have all these different ways of doing it? I'm curious that.
Yeah, I think different species have evolved different mating strategies, I think in part because of whatever the selective pressures of their environment are.
Yeah.
If you are putting out a huge number of reproductive seasonally, like right after a rain, to overwhelm the predators in the environment and just to make sure a few queens survive.
Right.
That might push for these giant mating flights. In contrast, if you're not producing very many queens, they might sneak out of the nest, call a male, mate, and sneak right back in the nest. Yeah. And that's a much more kind of protected way of doing it.
Right.
That makes sense.
Oh,
wow. That's incredible. So just switching gears a bit, I wanted to ask you about the impact that, and again, this is general because there's 15 to 20,000 different species, but just about the different impact ant colonies make on the health of our environments. What are their critical contributions to not only the landscape, but other coexisting species? Because I think it's a really important question. Thinking of like from the entomological perspective, like what our worlds would look like, we had talked to Dr. May Berenbaum, and she just said, you don't want to know how gross our world would be without insects. And ants are part of that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure May mentioned things like the pollination services and how little food we would have without pollination services.
Yes.
Ants are also incredibly important. They're diverse. They're incredibly common. Someone recently estimated something like 40 trillion ants on Earth. And because they're often scavengers, right, they are picking up things from the environment, dead insects that would be piling up, other detritus, and things that would really get in the way. There's a colleague of mine, Clint Pennick, who worked in New York, just looking at what the ants in the city streets were picking up. And they are garbage collectors, right? It's incredible just how much food and waste that gets thrown out in the streets are being picked up by ants and then brought underground. And so not only are they cleaning up the surface, by bringing these resources underground, right, they're actually really promoting nutrient turnover. They're digging soil out from underground and they're putting that on the surface, turning over the soil. They're bringing nutrients down into the ground where it could be used by other organisms and plants. Their colony tunnels and chambers help aerate the soil. They help water penetration into the soil. And so they're incredibly dynamic in terms of the benefits that they provide. For example, the soil that we then benefit from due to better agricultural practices. But on the surface, when they're eating other insects, those insects are often pests in our gardens, in our agricultural areas. So having ants present can actually benefit the yields of agriculture. I mean, not all ants, some ants are pests, right? And become problematic, particularly things like fire ants that might have a sting that, people are concerned about with livestock and stuff. But most ants aren't. I mean, most ants are incredibly beneficial. Right. And without their services, we would, like May Berenbaum had said, we would have a very different world, a much less pleasant world.
Right. Yeah. And I just think it's really important because I think ants are one of those insects that are around all the time. You see them all the time. And it's one of the first little insects I think children notice. They're crawling around on the ground and they see little, and I just think they're such the workers of our landscape. And I think we often just trot all over them, and fine. You can't like miss every ant when you're walking through your garden. That's fine. It's just, I think they are very, we need to hail the work they do more than, and I just think it's important.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think we have to, a lot of our agricultural practices, for example, we just think about pesticide use, but in urban areas as well. Like we just think of insects as the enemy. We don't want them in our houses. And I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I don't want roaches in my house, for example. I think roaches are really gross. I'm much more tolerant of, but if there was an ant colony just sweeping across my kitchen, I wouldn't want that either. And I think there are things that we can do to, as best as possible to discourage them from coming in our houses, or think about more environmentally friendly ways to deal with them rather than, broadcasting pesticides around the perimeter of your house or in agricultural areas where you might have non-target effects, which can be really bad as they affect other insects, which could be beneficial. We might be able to manage the landscape in such a way that is kind of reducing our interaction with the insects we don't want to interact with, but without wiping them out. And
right.
you probably heard from May, we are worried right now that we're experiencing an insect apocalypse, for lack of a better word, as a result of like pesticide use and land use changes and who knows what else, right? We have evidence that there have been declines in large groups of insects. People have argued that you drive down the road at night and your windshield is clear, and that wasn't the case in the 80s when it would be splattered with insects all the time.
Wow, that's so true. Yeah.
And I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and there were street lights in front of my house that were just covered with moths and June bugs and other things, and bats would be swooping down, and we just watched the bats eat the moths from these street lights. And the last time I went home to visit my parents, the same street light, now a good 40 plus years later. And, I didn't see any insects, maybe one or two, but it wasn't what I remembered, right? A very vivid memory of what it was like when I was.
Well, there's this cartoon that I've seen where the top bar is a man driving with all these insects. Then there's a man driving with no insects. And then there's the car in the windshield. There's no man because
if they all disappear, so do we. Yeah, right.
That's right. Yeah. We live in a very interconnected web of species, and you're losing a few here and there is not going to influence us too much, right? Losing too many undoubtedly will, or losing some key species that are, kind of hubs in our matrix of the way life is interconnected. That's what we're most worried about.
Yeah.
Well, and that sort of leads me to my next question of I was sort of saying why this conversation is important to us, but why do you think this is an important conversation, and how does this better connect us to the natural world, in context to what new perspectives and awarenesses can we gain from this conversation? I mean, that's our question, really.
Yeah, I think people have. I don't want to speak too generally, right? Because everyone is very different. My worry is that kids are growing up now with less of a connection to the natural world, in part because it's not in their backyards anymore. And, I grew up and I would walk down the street and there was a creek and there was a prairie. And if I go back to those same spots today, again, what was the far west suburbs of Chicago is now the near suburbs of Chicago. Now, there are no prairies. It's a highway, and all the natural areas are either agricultural or urban development. And so the experiences I had finding snakes under boards and frogs at the pond and ants under rocks, that even at a very young age started me on this path to connect with nature, love the environment, want to study ecology and how we are connected with the environment. I'm worried that kids these days aren't having those same experiences, and they're less likely to feel that connection. And if you don't have that connection from an early age, you might become numb to it. So now when you see an insect, even a butterfly, it's repulsive because you never really saw it in its environment. You only saw it in the context of something you didn't want in your house, right?
Right.
And that's my fear, is that through time, people are becoming just less excited about the natural world. They're seeing less awe and beauty in it because they're not having those experiences at young ages that really instilled that awe and beauty. That trip to a national park you might take at a young age. And if people are doing that less, that's going to really impact the way they view the environment and our role as stewards of the environment. Because, once it's gone, and more of it is disappearing. And I think we have to be much more attuned to what we can do now to preserve things for fear of extinction, right? Losing something forever.
Yep. Well, that is so beautifully said, actually. And it's so true. I mean, none of us could say that better. So thank you for just offering your perspective on that, because I think that's it's so true, and I think it's something we all need to hear again and again. So is there a way to support you, or where can we follow you or gain access to your research? Like, where can we find you?
Sure. So I have a very outdated website that I keep reminding myself I have to update. Where I, historically anyway, would keep track of what the lab was up to, things that we're publishing, what my students are doing, where they end up. In general, there are all sorts of ways that you can be supportive. I would say, first of all, is get outside, view the natural world. There are even great resources, apps that you can download to help you identify things. And I even though I study ants, I used to be an avid bird watcher. I always found that very relaxing, just to go outside and see what birds are around.
Yep.
But my biggest advice would be is, when you can, right, go out to a natural area and hike out and look around. The bigger picture, of course, is that the change in individual behavior, as good as it is and as important it is, it won't be as important as policy, right, level changes, to help us think of alternatives to pesticides that have long-lasting effects, or to think about ways that we can better preserve the environment nationally. So in that sense, I think something that everyone can do that's very helpful is vote with your ideals and conscious,
Right.
and get involved in policy. I think there are a lot of ways we can do that, either by writing people or running for local office or whatever you can do.
Right.
And I think all that's ultimately, that's the only way we'll make real change.
And those of you that have little babies and little kids, take them outside and show them the ants and talk to them about what they are and what they do at a young age, and that they're not gross, and that they're keeping our world clean, and all of those things. Because what you said earlier about that, there's not as much to look at, is just so true. So Andy, thank you for a conversation I have wanted to have for a very long time about ants. Super interesting, and just thank you so much for sharing your extensive knowledge and your time. We really appreciate it.
It was really my pleasure. Thank you so much, Kate and Jennifer, for having me.
Yeah, that was really
so much
great.
fun.
It was really fun. I love it. And enjoy your day tomorrow that you're having already, right?
That's right. I'm in the future. So if you need to know anything
You're in the
about
future. You are the future. The ants are the future. So thank you for that. Great. Thanks so much. Hello, and welcome back to The Takeaway. Thanks again to Andy for a lively and interesting and incredible conversation. And who knew there were 40-year-old ants? Okay, so
and who knew there were like thousands of species? I mean, different species.
One estimated 15 to 20,000 different species.
Yeah, I don't even understand that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
that's got to be unique.
I think
That's
it's unique.
Just so weird. Yeah.
Great. So maybe we should throw a couple props and shouts out to the ants in the world. But what did you have? What was your main takeaway?
So my main takeaway, listening back to the interview, was basically, I just thought it was so interesting that hearing him talk about ants and all the things that they do and all the ways that they support life on our planet. I was mostly struck by the same thing that I'm often struck by, but really it sort of crystallized in that idea of the less we understand about things in our world, like especially tiny little things like ants, the more we can otherize, and that we just don't really understand that they're not at all separate from us. Like everything he said, like it sort of crystallized on a micro level what's happening on a macro level, I guess I would say. And just all the jobs they have between the pollination and the cleanup and adding nutrients to the soil, all these things. It was just like, oh my gosh, when we don't understand, we are afraid, like when people, it just makes you scared. Like he said, if a bug gets in the house, people are afraid because it's so foreign. And him talking about, again, these same themes about we just need to familiarize ourselves with nature more. We need to be spending time in nature more in order to like I was also struck by like you saying that you'd seen the ants bump into each other, like you've actually observed them enough to see that and wondering what's happening, and now we know what's happening.
Yeah, right.
And just again, his depth and wealth of knowledge and just sharing that with us is such a gift, because it really does make me, I want to take a little kid outside and start looking under logs and check out the ants and what they're doing and what they're carrying, and it just anyway.
And we were talking earlier about how I think what you're talking about too is just normalizing nature, but in specific context, and this was like one of my big takeaways, was in specific context to children, because he was saying that like children aren't out turning over rocks, turning over logs. They're not finding lizards, snakes, like bugs, insects. They're not looking at the street lights anymore and seeing tons of insects surrounding them. Like, so like to your point, so then children are not growing up as a normal part of their day-to-day kind of life. And then, so when they're adults and living in their house, and you said like a bug gets in, they're like, oh my gosh, there's a bug in here. And it's gross now because they have no connection.
Right.
And it's not normal to see these, to sort of, we're used to this and we're interconnected.
Right. And that's right. And because it feels foreign and scary, like most people, they see a bug and they try to kill it immediately. That's their first instinct, is I have to kill this threat,
That's right. That's exactly right. And, I think the other thing I will say too, because that really was my biggest takeaway, is just can we, in general, once a day, once a week, once a month, take our children out and do some of this sort of, sitting on the side. You just have to sit on the sidewalk and you see ants milling around, and you don't need to go out into like the forest. You can be right in your own space, in your little back garden or your whatever. The other thing I was thinking was, you kind of sparked this in my brain, was how are we like them? How can we relate to them, right? And how important they are to the bigger collective, which made me think about when he was talking about, and I've heard this, how, there are lots of like people in IT and all kinds of different, government like areas of people are studying ants and how much we can learn from them.
Right. And just right. Like you were saying in the interview, how much room for error there could be in an ant
colony.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what he was saying, that they're studying, like, how are these predictors making things just work smoothly when you sometimes have hundreds of thousands of these little creatures all cohabitating.
It's crazy.
I mean, there is
I will say, what's that?
There's just so much to learn from them on so many levels. Yeah.
And like literally researchers are like learning so much. I just literally heard this thing on NPR the other day about how, don't ask me how, they're now quote unquote training ants to smell, I'll say in quotes, cancer. So it's sort of like just the amount of that we can learn, and how much, because what we know about them can translate actually to our lives. And I think that's such an important, that's our biggest takeaway, really. And just like, can we again like normalize nature? And but again, thank you so much to Andy for joining us. That was great.
It was such a delight to talk to him. I really I loved hearing everything he had to say. It was so great. And he's just a very obviously kind and lovely human. So another one.
Absolutely. So thank you to him. And just one other thing I want to let people know too is we don't really talk about where you can follow us, but you can follow us on Instagram and on Facebook, but primarily, I would say, on Instagram at the Kindred Pod. We've got a lot of good content we put up there, and stories and on posts, and it's just a fun way to see what we're up to. And again, thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you next time. Lots of love.
Bye.
Kindred is hosted by me and my sister Jen, produced by Kat Gaddy and myself, sound production and editing by Dan Cooper, original music by Ellie Grace, and our Kindred artwork was created by Lindsay Coffin. Please follow, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and feel free to contact us through our website at kindredpodcast.co, where you can also find links to our socials, Patreon page, and show notes.